Hey everyone, Chris here. Thanks for checking out the podcast. If you're enjoying it and learning something along with us, please consider becoming a supporting patron at patreon.com/ateachershistory. Or you could leave a rating and review on iTunes. It would be a huge help. If you'd like to raise your hand and participate along with us, you can find us on Facebook, Twitter, @ateachershistory, or shoot me an email, chris@ateachershistory.com. All right, let's get on to the next episode. Hello, welcome into A Teacher's History of the United States. Thanks so much for joining me again today. Did you know that the first railroad in the United States was built in 1830 and named the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, which for many of you Monopoly fans is the B&O Railroad? That the Erie Canal, which was finished a few years before the B&O Railroad, was built primarily by poor Irish immigrants, and that the evolution of the cotton mills and interchangeable parts dramatically changed the landscape of business and society in the North, further differentiating it from the American South. Did you know all of this? Maybe, maybe not. Get your notebooks out because today we will cover that and more in episode 119, The Industrial North. All right, everyone, welcome into episode 119. Two quick book recommendations before we dive into it today. The first is The Market Revolution, Jacksonian America, 1815 to 1846. It is by Charles Sellers. It is very detailed. It is very good, but it is also pretty dry. So if you're really into this, and if you're a huge history buff, which I know a lot of people that listen to this podcast are, I would recommend you check it out if you want to learn more about what we're covering here on this podcast episode today. And another book that is similar to it, not quite as dry, also good, also very good, is The Jacksonian Promise, America, 1815 to 1840, by Daniel Feller. So I'll put both of those books up on the website if you want to check them out, and if you'd like to know more about what we're covering today. So last week, we wrapped up our examination of American Southern society during this antebellum period. Over the last two episodes, we covered a lot of stuff, and these episodes may be some that you want to return to at a later date to refresh your memory. So with the South covered, now it's time to turn our attention to the North. Understanding what was happening simultaneously in many of the northern states will help you to understand why the perspectives of Northerners and Southerners in the United States was so drastically different. As we continue toward the Civil War over the next 30 years of American history, try to keep this stuff in mind. It will help you really appreciate the nuances of the lives of the people at the time and how their worldviews were, at times, so drastically different, even if they were all citizens, or slaves, of the same country. In this episode, we'll be covering a lot of the changing landscape in the North with the advances in technology and transportation. But what was business like prior to this time period? Well, for the most part, up to this point in American history, Northerners worked together on their family farms, creating a friendly community with their neighbors. They would help each other out with different tasks and barter goods that they needed. For the most part, they made or farmed what they needed. Nothing more, nothing less. In the cities, there were men and women involved in trade and craftsmanship. In these situations, men often found themselves in an apprentice model, where they would work for a master craftsman long enough until they were able to open up a shop on their own. Usually, these apprentices would be taken into their master's home and treated like a member of the family. women didn't have the opportunity for this type of formal training, and instead, well, those that did work were involved in occupations such as domestic servants, laundresses, or seamstresses. The other occupation some women held that is more uncomfortable to discuss is prostitution. Some women, prior to the industrialization of America, were prostitutes in a casual sense. They would sell their services for goods or money, sometimes when their husbands were out of town, and for the most part, it was a part of the societal fabric that went, well, undiscussed. During the growth of industry, though, there were more job opportunities available for women in certain industries. But depending on where you lived, they may have been few and far between. Because of this, prostitution and the existence of brothels became much more common, especially in port cities. They were seen as a necessary evil in society, an opportunity for these transient men, like sailors or soldiers, to have their needs met, contributing to a more orderly society, some would argue. With the low wages being offered to women, the work stoppages, and lack of upward mobility, many women in cities did turn to prostitution. Over time, though, society began to stop justifying this behavior and refocus their attention on the purity of women, shaming those who participated and ostracizing them from polite society. We still see this often today, with many contending that this type of behavior is immoral and a corrupting influence to our societal fabric that some Americans are striving to maintain. Pivoting back to pre-industrial America, though, we can see that the challenges many women dealt with when it came to income and opportunity had existed for decades. The man was the patriarch of the family and had unquestioned authority. The wife took care of the household. The man practiced his craft, and any daughters helped their mothers, and sons were told who they were going to apprentice with and where they were going to apprentice. And when I say the man had unquestioned authority, I mean it. Legally, men had all the power. A married woman's property belonged to her husband. A woman could not testify in court. Heck, in a divorce, the man would keep the children because legally, well, they were his property. Now at this time, prior to all the industrial changes in the North, there was a pretty distinct social order. In cities, it was the common laborer at the bottom, then the artisan, then the urban merchant. In rural areas, it was the tenant farmer, the yeoman farmer, and the large landowner. With the revolution of transportation, the marketplace, and industry came new opportunities to disrupt this social order and reshape American society. The most drastic change that sparked this reshaping of the American economy and northern society came in the form of the transportation revolution. Roads, canals, and railroads were game changers. Not only could individuals now travel long distances looking for new opportunities in other areas of the nation, but goods were shipped in from other areas of the country. So if people did want to stay put, they were able to experience life in ways that they never were able to before. At the turn of the 19th century, roads existed, but sometimes were so crude and poorly maintained they were useless. In the spring and the fall, they were at times too muddy to use, and in the winter, the snow could make travel almost impossible. Localities tried to keep up the roads and even collected tolls at really important junctures, but in the end, it wasn't a particularly effective way of traveling. This all began to slowly change in 1808, when the federal government made, at the time, a huge investment in the national road. This road, built of gravel on a stone foundation, began in Cumberland, Maryland, and would open the mid-Atlantic region up to the west, eventually connecting to the Mississippi River by 1850. But while progress was being made on roads, when it came to commercial uses and businesses, they just weren't adequate. Water travel was far more affordable and sensible at this time. The problem was that it primarily existed along the coast. Grain could be shipped from port city to port city, but there was no efficient way to get goods west. That all changed with the creation of the canal system. The most famous of these canals, of course, was the Erie Canal. In 1817, New York Governor DeWitt Clinton, God, I love the name DeWitt, proposed this idea, which sounded a bit crazy to some, of building a canal that would connect the Hudson River to Lake Erie. And since the Hudson River ran all the way down to New York City, it would, in effect, connect New York City to Lake Erie. Using Lake Erie, you could gain direct access to much of the West. This was derided by some and jokingly referred to as Clinton's Ditch. But when it was all said and done, the Erie Canal was an incredible feat. When it was complete 8 years later, in 1825, it was 364 miles long, with 83 locks and over 300 bridges. It was an impressive engineering feat. One thing that's important to note about the construction of the canal is how much they relied on immigrant labor for its completion. With malaria sending home much of the American workforce in 1819, these American businessmen turned toward the Irish, advertising in Ireland that they would provide, quote, meat 3 times a day, plenty of bread and vegetables, with a reasonable allowance of liquor, and $8, $10, or $12 a month for wages. Reading this, poor Irishmen were lured into the opportunity. Without money to pay for their trip over to the U.S., the trip was often paid for by the American contractor. Thus, the Irish worker was indebted to his boss before he even stepped foot into the United States or met him. This indentured servitude created a scenario that saw some of these workers living and working in conditions worse than that of Southern slaves. And in some ways, they were treated worse. While these men weren't literally owned by the contractor like slaves were, their debt that they owed them made them, for all intents and purposes, labor slaves. And one big difference was that slaves in the South were the property of their masters. But that meant they were a heavy investment. They were needed to increase crop yields. Good, hardworking slaves cost a lot of time, energy, and money to find, whereas these Irish immigrants, not so much. And keep in mind, as I talk about the treatment of these Irish immigrants, please don't think I'm trying to make some type of false equivalency between their experiences and actually being a piece of property in the South, like an actual slave. But you will see that it was pretty bad. American contractors were purposefully bringing in more labor than they needed, knowing that it would drive down wages. With these Irishmen coming over in waves, the labor became dirt cheap, and the treatment of these men reflected this reality. The Irishmen would work 12 to 15 hours a day and often into the night, their progress being lit by bonfires. They worked through extreme weather with water up to their knees or higher, often in dangerous conditions. Their hygiene was pretty terrible. It led to illness and death. One observer of canal construction in 1839, right, so this is about 15 years after the completion of the Erie Canal, so this is a different canal, and this canal had conditions that similarly represented the Erie Canal. This observer said, quote, laboring from day to day in lowlands and stagnant water, human life has proved to be very short. Out of the 1,500 laboring men employed on the canal, 1,000 died during the past year of overexertion and the diseases incident to the climate, fever and ague and bilious weather. In addition to these terrible conditions, many of these Irish workers had their meager pay supplemented by alcohol, which you could imagine led to immoral behavior, a poor reputation, and transparent discrimination. In the end, though, setting aside the treatment of the workers for a moment, the construction of the canal was a modern technological miracle to some. The completion of the canal, in less than the 10-year promise, which at the time seemed a bit overly ambitious, opened up the West to easy passage, spurring trade between the West and the East, and attracting settlement to the West from the American East and from the increasing wave of immigrants. Small towns along the canal, like Rochester and Buffalo, became booming cities, and the access of the interior that the canal gave to New York City made it the undeniable center of commercial and financial power in the United States. The roaring success of the Erie Canal had some other major impacts too. Not only did it connect the West and the East, but it spurred hundreds of millions of dollars in investments in other canals all over the country. It also set the precedent for cheap immigrant labor. Moving forward in American history, we will see that as more immigrants come into the U.S., businesses were taking advantage of their lack of leverage in the marketplace and putting them through brutal working conditions for very little pay in order to maximize profit as much as possible. Making the increase in canal construction even more impactful was the invention and development of the steamboat by Robert Fulton in 1807. Up to this point, commercial trade had been executed on flatboats, and goods would oftentimes be shipped downriver. And since the trip back upriver was so long and arduous, the boats themselves would sometimes be sold for lumber, while the traders made their way back to where they came from on foot. With the development of the steamboat, all of that changed. Now you could take the steamboat downriver and upriver, spurring a huge jump in trade all throughout the interior. In fact, Cincinnati, Ohio, which is located on the Ohio River and is one of my favorite cities in the U.S., owes much of its growth to the steamboat, seen as it was a center hub for steamboat manufacture and machine tool production. While the canals and steamboats were increasing trade via waterways, the invention of the American Railroad in 1830 took trade, investment, and transportation to another level in the United States. The first railroad in the U.S., the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, or the B&O Railroad, began in 1830 with 13 miles of track. 30 years later, by 1860, it no longer had 13 miles of track. It had grown to 31,000 miles of track. The growth of the railroad led to the growth of the iron industry, seeing as how the tracks had to be iron, not wooden. And by the late 1850s, when the local railroads consolidated into larger ones, it was the primary source of transportation for people and goods. The transportation revolution dramatically changed the United States of America, especially in the North. Huge investments in new technology were being made from Americans and from overseas. The ever-changing landscape of the U.S. during this time and the constant development of new technologies led to a spirit of invention and innovation, something America is still known for today. These roads, canals, and railroads spurred even more movement of the American people, and they began to move like no other nation before them. With the attention, politically, economically, and socially, moving away from all of the coastal towns and beginning to center more on the heartland of the nation. With this revolution in transportation came a revolution in the American economy. Historians often refer to the economic and social changes at this time period as the market revolution, which was the coalescence of the rapid changes in transportation, commercialization, and industrialization that the North was experiencing. In the first wave of commercialization, the end of the 18th century and early 19th century, Americans saw men like John Jacob Astor make an incredible fortune off of trade and real estate, with Astor owning the American Fur Company and retiring in 1834 with $25 million, making him by far the richest man in the United States. Many businessmen in these coastal cities who were building their wealth began to turn to investments in trade, putting their money into things like slaves, iron, lumber, and rum. As the business landscape began to change and men wanted to invest heavily in new technologies, banks were willing to make more loans, looking to profit themselves. The other option was to go right to your family, which men like Francis Cabot Lowell did when he borrowed about $300,000 from family and friends to build the first automated cotton mill. And he's someone we'll talk more about later in this episode. As I mentioned a couple minutes ago, this revolution in America sparked a spirit of invention and innovation, but it also promoted an attitude of the bigger the risk, the bigger the reward. Many men were doubling down on their businesses and going all in, and creating incredible wealth in the process. While this was great for them and good for the economy as a whole, it was creating a society that was top-heavy in wealth accumulation. For example, in Boston in 1771, the top 1% of earners held 16% of all the wealth. Well, by 1848, the top 1% of earners held not 16%, but 37% of all the wealth. Conversely, in Boston in 1771, the lowest 80% of earners, so the lowest 80% of the population, held 29% of the wealth, whereas in 1848, they owned only 4% of the wealth. The bottom 80% of the workers combined owned only 4% of the wealth. I mentioned briefly in episodes 117 and 118 that the Southern cotton trade benefited the North as well as the South. You may have been wondering how exactly that was the case. Well, Northern builders built the ships used to transport the cotton, thus controlling the trade. They provided the nation's banking, the insurance, and almost all of the financial services. In fact, some of these northern companies were making so much money off of the cotton trade that sometimes southern planters would complain about their margins, lamenting that these northern companies were taking over a third of their profit. As we reflect upon this and begin to understand just how interconnected these industries were, it becomes more and more apparent that many of these northern businesses found much of their wealth and success due to the cotton that was being produced by African American slavery in the South. Coinciding with the boom of opportunity in the North came a change in how things were manufactured. Initially, in the United States, an artisan would make an entire product in his shop. For example, a shoemaker would make the entire shoe. Well, early in the 19th century, this process began to change. Soon, businessmen created systems in which different households would make just one part of a finished product and make it on a much higher scale. This system was known as the putting out system, because the merchant would put out the raw material to the families and then pay them for the finished piece before selling the completed item to market. Dividing up the labor was far more efficient and profitable and led to even more ideas about how to divide labor up even further and build systems like these on a mass scale. Industrialization in the United States took the basic concepts of the putting out system and morphed them into a far more profitable and productive model. And much of America's early success in this industrialization is owed to a man named Samuel Slater. In 1789, Slater had just wrapped up an apprenticeship in England at a cotton spinning factory. Now, keep in mind, at this time, England was at the forefront of industrial technology, and it had provided for them such an advantageous position in the world market that they were highly secretive, forbidding any export of this technology, and even didn't allow the emigration of any skilled worker to other countries. So Samuel Slater knew the technology and knew there were huge opportunities in the United States with that type of knowledge, but also knew it was illegal for him to leave England. So, he disguised himself as a farm laborer and secretly boarded a ship to America. Being so secretive, he didn't even tell his family goodbye. When he arrived, Slater met a couple American entrepreneurs who had been trying to figure out how to duplicate England's technology. Slater, having committed it to memory, showed them how. And in 1790, Slater's mill opened up, and it immediately was the most advanced cotton mill in America. With this new technology arriving in America, river shores in the North became full of cotton mills. The most well-known cotton mill during this time period was the Lowell Mill in Lowell, Massachusetts. I mentioned a little bit ago that a man named Francis Cabot Lowell had borrowed $300,000 from his family and friends to invest in a business. Well, this is that business. Similar to Slater, in 1810, Lowell traveled to England and took a tour of a British textile mill. But what his host in England didn't realize was that each night Lowell was going back to his room and drawing out sketches of the machinery that he was examining each day. Like Slater, Lowell brought the intel back to the U.S. and put it into action. Lowell not only made the machinery even more efficient, but he also invented the power loom. Now, all aspects of the textile manufacturing could be completed at the same factory. Lowell and his partners made a great profit, and eventually, following his early death, his partners built an entire town around the mills, naming it Lowell, Massachusetts, after Francis, which eventually became nicknamed the, quote, City of Spindles. And this city was the first of its kind. From the years 1826 to 1836, the population grew from 2,500 to 17,000. The Lowell Mill is the most well-known of the 19th century mills. Samuel Slater had established a hiring method of employing children, men, and women, with about half of his employees being children ages 8 to 12, and the other half split between men and women, with men working the higher-paying jobs. Lowell, Massachusetts was a bit different, though. Their mills employed pretty much all women. Nicknamed the Lowell Mill Girls, these women set a new standard for the New England textile factory worker. Newspapers advertised all over the area looking for girls aged 15 to 25 to hire. For many families, this opportunity to have their daughters work for a wage was an appealing one. Many of the girls who were working on farms looked forward to the opportunity to get away from home and experience something new, maybe making friends in the process. Who knows? Most of the Lowell Mill girls lived in boarding houses, right there in Lowell, Massachusetts. In addition to the boarding houses, Lowell had dozens of mills, hotels, churches, city buildings, and other company housing. It truly was a city that existed solely for the purpose of the mill. The boarding houses that the mill girls stayed in were run by an older female keeper, making sure the girls acted properly and were responsible and disciplined. About 4 to 5 women would live and sleep in the same room, creating cramped quarters but also deep personal bonds. So, what was a normal day like for these Lowell Mill girls? Pretty grueling. The mill girls would wake up at 4:30 a.m. sharp to the sound of the bell tower, and they would labor all day. The men who ran the corporations and managed these mills were far more interested in just putting out a good product and making sure the women didn't do anything to mess that up. They controlled the social lives of many of these mill girls, making sure they observed the Sabbath and didn't drink. These young women would work 12 to 14 hours a day and half a day on Saturday for usually about 9 to 10 months a year, with many of them visiting their family farms in the summer. One mill girl, Harriet Robinson, who was only 10 when she started her career, reflected on her time in Lowell. Quote, "I can see myself now, racing down the alley between the spinning frames, carrying in front of me a bobbin box bigger than I was. All the mill girls make good use of their money. The mortgage is lifted from the homestead. The farmhouse is painted. Mill girls help maintain widowed mothers and drunken or invalid fathers. We were paid $2 a week. Oh, how proud I was when it came to my turn to stand up on the bobbin box." While the conditions sound rough and the pay was meager, mill life was incredibly impactful in positive ways to these young women. Working in mills like the Lowell Mill, and just to be clear, it wasn't the only one. These mills were all over the place in New England, but were usually quite small and have more of a mixed workforce. But working in a place like Lowell provided these young women with a sense of purpose, individuality, responsibility, and independence. All things that we as Americans cherish today. But the development of mills, mostly stolen from English blueprints, weren't the only outcome of the industrialization period in the U.S. In fact, American entrepreneurship and creative spirit shined through during this period, with one Frenchman noting that Americans were, quote, mechanics by nature, and that, quote, in Massachusetts and Connecticut, there is not a laborer who has not invented a machine or tool. Arguably, the biggest game changer out of everything during this time period was the concept of interchangeable parts. This was first used in gun manufacturing. The basic concept was that all of the parts of the gun were created by molds. Therefore, every single gun had all the same parts. This is something we experience with almost everything we buy today, but back then, in the early 19th century, this was incredible to consider. Up to this point, each gun, like pretty much everything else, was made soup to nuts. And while they looked the same, there were small differences in the parts from one item to the next. Because of this concept of interchangeable parts, replacing a broken piece of the gun as opposed to trying to make a new piece from scratch, or heck, make a whole new gun, revolutionized the industry. The machines that were eventually developed to standardize production for things as simple as nails and complex as clocks changed the market drastically. Now, these items were not made by hand from beginning to end, but put together in an organized, repeatable fashion. And because of that, regular people were able to afford more luxurious items, such as a clock or a sewing machine. In one of my favorite quotes about the American spirit during this time, historian David Potter remarked that, quote, European radical thought is prone to demand that the man of property be stripped of his carriage and his fine clothes. But American radical thought is likely to insist instead that the ordinary man is entitled to mass-produced copies, indistinguishable from the originals. As you could likely imagine, the changes that rocked American northern industry at this time effectively destroyed artisan production and the apprenticeship system, while also weakening the patriarchal control over family members, both sons and daughters. This new work structure in the North also created some tension between the North and the South. I've already mentioned how the North and the South were inextricably linked through the cotton trade, but Southerners began to become more indignant about Northern moralizing. While under the artisan and apprenticeship model, the master took a lot of responsibility, teaching and caring for his apprentice. But this new model, working young women from 5 a.m. to 7 p.m., forcing them to adhere to strict social discipline and housing rules, didn't sound so great. In fact, some Southerners peddled a seemingly sound argument that the, quote, wage slavery in the North was even worse than Southern slavery. And over time, these factories did not provide housing or food for their workers. They didn't care for the old, the disabled, or ill workers. And for the most part, they just viewed each worker as a cog in their machine that existed to make them a profit. And while we all know the idea that this was worse than plantation slavery is sort of ridiculous, the South had a point. This was a really heartless system in some ways. As you pack up your things, I would like you to consider how drastically different Northern and Southern society were becoming during this antebellum period in American history. While the wage slave argument held some merit and picked up momentum in the South, it was clear that while the South was resisting technology and stubbornly marrying themselves to African American slavery, the North was industrializing, seeing expansions in industry and transportation. It was providing new opportunities, albeit sometimes pretty crappy ones, to new immigrants, empowering young women, and redefining what it meant to be a business in the United States of America. Canals, steamboats, and railroads transformed American trade, and the power loom and interchangeable parts had just as big of an impact on American industrialization and, in turn, life. Next week, we jump back into our narrative. Don't forget, we have a new president, Andrew Jackson. And man, were people excited about President Jackson, making sure they threw the biggest inaugural party America had ever seen. We'll cover that next episode. Thanks for listening, and hopefully now you can take pride in knowing just a little bit more about the history of the United States. Class dismissed.